Welcome to the Innovate Europe podcast, where we talk to the funders and founders and all of those who are shaping the European tech and innovation ecosystem. I'm your host, Clark Parsons, the managing director of the Innovate Europe Foundation, also the CEO of the European Startup Network. And I'm joined today by Yann Lechelle, the co-founder and CEO at probabl.ai. Yann, we've known each other for quite some time, and you have an amazing tech career. You started, like many in the tech world, as a teenage entrepreneur. You were a software engineer at different companies, including DreamWorks Animation, briefly in your youth. But you went on to found and co-found a lot of amazing different companies, 5, in fact, I think, if we count correctly, Kick Your App, AppsFire, and of course, most recently, Probabl. But you've also been the COO at Snibs, so you're a part of all of my Sonos home kit, thanks to an acquisition. You were the CEO at Scaleway, and you were the entrepreneur in residence at INRIA and INSEAD. INRIA being the amazing French research institution for science, and INSEAD, one of Europe's leading MBA programs. So you really are one of the great figures in European tech. It's really a delight to have you with us. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Clark. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me on the show.
Super. Well, tell me, it's so awesome and fascinating how many entrepreneurs I talk to started as teenage programmers or teenage entrepreneurs. Get me from being a teenage entrepreneur growing up in France to the path you're on now, and probabl. I mean, it's when we were growing up, and you're roughly my age, entrepreneurism in Europe wasn't necessarily a thing. So how did you go from being a teenage coder to getting on this path of being a business person?
Well, I suppose as a teenager, you either, decide to do a lot of sports, or you lean on random encounters. But if you're sort of introverted and your parents give you the budget or offer you a computer at that age, then you discover unlimited potential. And this is exactly what happened to me. In other words, my parents offered me the computer that I didn't ask for
Really?
at age 10.
At age 10? Okay.
So it was a pocket computer, and the rest is history. In other words, once you are curious about the possibilities with such a device, then curiosity leads everything else. And it's just, pulling the thread. And with every new generation of computer, every year, every 2 years, then you double the memory capacity, the number of transistors following Moore's law. And so I believe that personal computing in the 80s created careers based on the tremendous possibilities that we all intuited in so many ways, right? And then came the internet, and then came, broad adoption way, because the internet also started around that time, but was only reserved for military or academic institutions. But the point is, the personal computer era created careers like myself. Some people were in the hub of innovation in Silicon Valley, and others across the world benefited with a little bit more, latency, if you wish. But I was based in the north of France, so not in Paris, not in London, not in New York, not in Silicon Valley. And nevertheless, I was able to acquire 8-bit computers from Atari. And then the next computer also later on in the early 90s. Technology was distributed and created the possibilities for unlimited potential, either to create personal interest derivative projects, or in my case, very quickly, I saw the potential for society. So that became a drive, which became my hobby, which naturally evolved into entrepreneurship, where technology can be used for so many things. It is a universal technology in many ways.
That's brilliant. I mean, I loved that era too, because whether it was punk music or personal computer age, there were no adults in charge. It really felt like the people who were tinkering were leading the way. And so, it wasn't as hierarchical or stratified. You could really just do what you wanted. Getting into entrepreneurship, ironically, thanks to United States business schools and that mentality, going into entrepreneurship in a way feels kind of codified. So I'm curious, about your path as an entrepreneur. What were you picking up along the way? I mean, when did you decided, I guess, very early, hey, I don't need somebody to give me permission to be running a business and thinking like an entrepreneur. Tell me about your path of what you were picking up as an entrepreneur and how each step has reinforced the next.
So we could say that I was entrepreneurial from the get-go because I was pretty much on my own. So my parents did enable that possibility, but then I took things in my own hands. As you said, no adult in the room. I was in my room alone, tinkering. And then as soon as I could, I connected to the grid. So at age 17, I was building social networks. But then because I thought that this was something that I could enable as well, I created software to create social networks in 1989.
Mm.
So I was as an entrepreneur as a teenager, and I paired with my cousin, and we developed a sort of social networking technology, so B2B2C, which we sold, I think, nearly 1,000 copies of, right? So we sold software licenses to build social networks in a B2B2C fashion before it was coined entrepreneurship. We had a software editor that took the code, we drafted a contract, and there we go. So I was probably in that mindset before it became a sort of a playbook, although Silicon Valley is a term that was coined in the 1970s, 71 actually, my date of birth. And Silicon Valley has benefited from the American venture capital industry, which has been around for so many more years, right? We're talking about 100 years in the US,
Mm-hmm.
with Bessemer being the primary VCs. So Silicon Valley plus the financial playbook had a head start in the US. In France, I started off as a software engineer. That's it. So
Mm-hmm.
the first part of my career was one of a software engineer. And I created a sort of tool to help myself while I was admitted or while I was applying to business schools. And I received a letter of admission at INSEAD, the business school, in 1999. And the letter said, congrats, you've been admitted. See you in September with your check. And I was like, okay, cool. But I really don't know if I want to commit to that tuition plus losing a year of productive employment.
Uh-huh.
So I built a social network once again. So I'd done that in 1999,
Uh-huh.
did that again in 1999, building one of the very first SaaS social network on the internet. Social networks have been around forever. There's in the 70s, 80s, whatever. Social networks are not new by far, and I did not invent anything by far. That being said, I built a social network for my own class of admitted students
Mm-hmm.
so that we could network ahead of being enrolled, so that we could decide through the social networking whether we wanted to commit and join the program. I called the school. They gave me the list of emails of all the admitted candidates. I put everyone on a social network. I loved the community. I confirmed my admission and I joined INSEAD. And at INSEAD, this became my playbook. This became my business plan. And I created a company for it the day after graduation. Now, the MBA program in 2000 at INSEAD only had 2 classes for entrepreneurship, only 2 classes.
Only 2.
So entrepreneurship was not well referenced as an activity for business. You had 2 classes, 2 electives, one of which was realizing entrepreneurial potential. In other words, that meant buying companies, buying smaller companies and growing them. And the other one was new ventures, i.e. starting a new company from scratch. No other electives around entrepreneurship. Today at INSEAD, they have more like 30 electives. Right? So entrepreneurship in that business school, which is, of course, world-class, but very French, we've gone from 0 to 1 in 25 years. The same goes for the French tech ecosystem, has gone from 0 to almost 1 in Paris and in France at large over the past 25 years. So I became an entrepreneur in the 80s before it was known as entrepreneurship here. And I became an entrepreneur in 2000 before it became cool and obvious. It's a problem to be right too early.
No, that's the problem with tech in general. But being too early, it's funny that you pointed out. I mean, we're old enough to remember so many different social networks that have come and gone and business models that have come and gone. And then 10 years later, it flies. I'm intrigued by being an entrepreneur in residence, which you've done also at INSEAD, given the fact that when you started, there was almost so little. I mean, I think most business schools 20 years ago were sending people into consulting or to investment banking. And now I think at most business schools, the people want to start their own company. They want to be entrepreneurs. Tell me what, for you, coming from the software and the product side, is that a key element of entrepreneurship for you, aside from just sort of knowing how to do the numbers and manage people, et cetera? I think there's sort of a spark in there as well for entrepreneurship because you've started so many companies. There's an itch you have, right? Well, tell me about this sort of what for you are kind of the key ingredients for entrepreneurship.
So my drive, as I've described, is also deeply anchored in software technology. And I always used a product vision that I had to kickstart the creation of a formal company. This is me. That does not necessarily translate to everyone's decision to be an entrepreneur. Some people will be financially driven. Some people will be independence driven. Some people will have a financial slash marketing slash sales orientation, could be the CEO. Sometimes they will need to pair with the CTO. And very often it's a good idea. In my case, I started off as being two-sided at once. So after the MBA, I realized that you needed to apply proper business planning, which is not something that I necessarily had a lot of intuition about before the MBA. Before the MBA, I was very much focusing on technology. And after the MBA, I realized that actually uh, it's an art and science to sell anything, and it's an art and science to build anything. So I started off as a solo entrepreneur. And after that, I mixed different models, either with raising capital or without, with co-founders and without. And so there are so many possible permutations. At INSEAD, I was an entrepreneur in residence, but more like a coach. I was not actually on residence. I was coming to campus to do office hours as an entrepreneur to help future MBAs decide whether they would jump into the industry as employees, typically top management, or become an entrepreneur, and on what basis. So really, work out on the intrinsic motivations that drive individuals, because I've seen a lot of the case. But the other entrepreneurship in residence that you talk about at INRIA was actually applied. So I was physically there
Hmm.
working in a specific project that became entrepreneurial.
Hmm. You got to coach so many people. I'd love to think about here for a second, INSEAD. You've had the benefit now of time. You've seen the people that you've coached, see where they went. Have you learned some things about what makes a successful entrepreneur? Things where maybe you misjudged somebody in the beginning and they proved it, or the other way around? I'm curious to know what you might have learned as the coach in the path that some of your mentees have taken in
Yeah.
entrepreneurship.
So the way INSEAD set it up was very interesting. So they created a pool of mentors, entrepreneurs in residence, and then the students pick and choose who they would like to talk to. And so typically I haven't done it in a while, but I did spend many single days meeting 8 people in a row. Right? So it's really intense. And so typically I ask the hard questions. I come in, I don't have any stake into it. So I'm really truthful and frank. I talk about the project. Sometimes I follow up, of course, beyond the framework. But in some cases, I really ask the tough questions about the intrinsic motivations. Some people more recently felt like entrepreneurship was cool, and that's not enough.
Mm.
So my intuition was that the hard questions really matter in terms of motivation because it's a long journey with ups and downs and so on and so forth. And I've come to realize, and this is something that I built into my message, was that Entrepreneurship is an art as well. The numbers actually prove that nobody has cracked the ultimate equation that leads to success. Hence, what really matters is the alignment of stars that comprise the idea, the timing, the co-founding team, and possibly the co-founding team is the single most important equation, part of the equation. At the beginning, all the way up to things that people don't realize. But if you are two co-founders with a family, or two co-founders with a spouse, that means starting a company with four people. People don't realize that partners play an essential part. And also the difference of backup, financial means, personal means that each founder brings to the table. As soon as you have more than one founder, then there's a balance or imbalance that is created as a result of financial independence, linked to spouses, linked to children. And if those questions are not dealt with right away, it's a recipe for disaster. So it's stronger than a wedding. It's a multilateral, multi-party wedding. So the contract has to be rock solid.
That's interesting. I don't know if I've heard anybody articulate that element, which is really an important one, which is that, just because two people get along and think, hey, this is this would be a cool product to build, let's go. You really are kind of marrying somebody depending on the life of a company. You're talking 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, 15, 20, 30 years together. So take a look at, their environment and their support system.
And typically, thinking like a lawyer is pretty good in that case. You need to think about the divorce. Think about the divorce first
Yeah.
so that you can work backwards from it and build the proper conditions for the marriage. So that's my one advice on co-founders, typically, but there are many more subtleties to it, of course, because at the end of the day, it's very exciting. It's an exciting journey. I love when we create the conditions for new value creation, right? You can have a business that is predatory, that wants to, essentially target a current player and disrupt a field with existing players. But what I really love is the exciting journey and the possibilities of using tech to create new value out of nothing. I absolutely adore that. But that's me. That's just me, right?
That's super. No, that's a great motivation. Let's talk about Probable, your current project, because of that. I mean, after all of these companies you founded, here you are back again, leading a small team, a startup. Tell me about what motivated you to jump in and do this, and tell me the problem that Probable is solving.
Thank you. So Probable is unique in many ways. It's a project that came to me, actually. So before Probable, I was CEO at Scaleway, a regional cloud provider that belongs to the Iliad telecom player in France, but it's also European in scale. But Scaleway was a small cloud provider, almost hidden away inside that telecom operator. And so I hyperscaled it for 3 years, thinking that we needed to, and this matches what you're doing as well, we need to fight. We need to build up European capacities to serve itself through, of course, the supply side, through startups, but also through industrial players. And we know that most of the value in the stack is being captured by a handful of companies, which I admire, by the way. I mean, US companies, you know them, we know them. The usual suspects, I call them. We can use the Magnificent Seven or the Scary Seven, whatever. But these companies have become too big for their own good. They're not even, at this point, they're probably create a barrier to innovation, even in the US within itself. And that's why some parties are willing to break up Google or Microsoft. And actually, those are good questions. In other words, if you want to keep making sure that innovation happens at scale, you need to make sure that oligopolies or anything that looks like it that leverages Metcalfe's law that regulators can't deal with because it's too exponential. These companies need competition. The thing is, Europe has not produced the proper competition against these companies, and that's not good for Europe. It's not good for the US, and I'm really upset about it. Again, not because I don't like these companies. I think I like them a lot. What I care about is that Europe stands on its own as well. And because I do also like the US as a country, and I think that we are sharing democratic values, with the US, then we need to ensure that Europe is the actual sparring partner to the US. So I'm sure as an American based in Europe, this probably makes sense to you. So how do we create the level playing field so that Europe is a proper sparring partner to the US to protect democratic values, to make sure that we leverage the market to ensure, and that goes back to my personal DNA, how do we make sure that technology creates opportunities, creates new value for the entire society? So I did this at Scaleway for 3 years. And after that, I left in January 2023 and I wrote a manifesto, as one does, on Medium. And I said, look, these are the things I like to do. These are the things I care about. You, my readers, my network, and I have an extensive network, you know best what I should be doing because I've been heads down scaling this company, managing 600 people in the cloud, but I'm probably missing something. So I care about, of course, AI, open source, cloud, cybersecurity, future of work. So all these things I put in my manifesto. But I care also about Europe and sovereignty, digital sovereignty, which means not being too dependent so that you can be the sparring partner. So I articulated that in a post. I met 140 people
Wow.
in a span of 7 weeks. And meeting anyone about anything who responded to my call for conversation. What is it that matters? What is it that we should be talking about? What is it that I should be looking at? Of course, looking for not a job, but something to do that matches my interest and keeps me busy for the next 10 years based on what I'm able to do. And so I had about 50 opportunities to dive into, 11 themes that I care about, 12 offers, 3 in my shortlist, and Probable was one of them.
Wow.
As early
Wow.
as January 17th, 2023. So within 2 weeks of leaving Scaleway. And so a team from INRIA came to me by saying, Yann, we have a problem, a good problem. We are in charge of a technology called Scikit-learn at INRIA, which is a framework that has been incubated, if you wish, at INRIA for the past 10 plus years. And this framework is global. It is the most popular open source framework for machine learning in the world, Scikit-learn. And I knew about it, of course. And they said the French government has identified it as one of the rare assets we have. It's true. We have very few assets, and that's one of them. But it was hidden away. Nobody knows it's French. Nobody knew it came from INRIA. And the French government said, we want to put some money on the table to build on top of it with a mission, which is to build a suite of open source technology for machine learning around scikit-learn. And the government said, please break even. And that's where researchers said, and this is a caricature, but they said, what is break even?
Exactly.
So they came to me saying, we probably need an entrepreneur to look at this from the business perspective to propose perhaps a sort of spin-off. So I spent 4 months as an entrepreneur in residence, and I proposed a structure very unique because it is based on a universal asset that belongs to France in some way, but is universal in a sense that with a 2.5 billion downloads, 100 million downloads per month, 22% US, 25% China, 5% UK, 4% Germany, 3% France. So France is exporting massively this technology that every data scientist on the planet uses daily if they do data science for breakfast. They wake up, they sip coffee, and they use this thing for free. They take it for granted. So the question is, what sort of business do you build around it without, and that's basically the deal, without affecting the license that everyone takes for granted? So the goal here is not to do a bait and switch type of business where you switch violently the license, as others have done, but more find a value-added proposition on top of scikit-learn while we remain the exclusive operator of the brand.
This is great. Tell me how, because you've been at a business school and you think like an entrepreneur. This is to me one of the dilemmas of the open source and open science model is how to capture the value, because this is what the Magnificent Seven do so well: is they drill down and build, kind of a walled garden of a product and close off the world and become worth 2 trillion. And in Europe, it feels like we often are building so much of the structure that's beneath all of these products, but someone else is capturing the value. How can Europe continue to stay in the lead as it is in terms of all of the open source and all of the guts of how machine learning and data science and everything around the cloud and the internet is working? But how can Europe capture more of that value?
So there are two questions in your question. There's the one about Probable and being a company that captures financial value to sustain itself. You cannot depend on government money all the time. It's okay to start with a bit of subsidies. In this particular case, a project was gifted subsidies from the get-go because the government said, here is what we want to spend the money on for this particular technology. So in our case, there was a bit of that, but clearly the goal is to break even and be profit generating. Clearly, that's my case. It's a unique case. And when we talk about open source, contrary to the VC world that has become accustomed to SaaS, software as a service, which is the sort of obfuscated shell that sells services, and the software is hidden away behind the Stripe payment, right? So that's the classic model that everyone understands, and SaaS screams value capture. Now, open source is a very different beast. It is counterintuitive in so many ways, because if we think value capture, open source is all about value distribution. But my prism concerns Europe as a whole. So we can talk about probable. That's one way to look at the problem. But we can talk about Europe at home. Europe is a challenger. Europe is lagging behind. And I usually use the analogy with Africa. Africa did not invest in mobile technology or even in telecom technology for decades, but they did catch up to some degree by adopting mobile technology. So maybe 30-year gap of not investing in telecom infrastructure. In the end, they adopted mobile technology to bring society in a number of African countries to do microtransactions and distribute educational content and so on and so forth. So they caught up by changing something and doing a leapfrog. Europe has no telecommunication problem, but it has an infrastructure problem. It did not invest in cloud infrastructure, which leads to the fact that three hyperscalers command 70% of the European market revenue. So Europe is lagging behind. How do we catch up? It turns out that openness, open source, open science, open standards, open weights when it comes to AI is a way to catch up if you adopt it radically. Now, if you look at big tech, they use open source to counter big tech. If you look at China, they use open source and open weights like DeepSeek to counter US domination. So openness, and I can talk about probable, can be a business model. There's no issue there. It's just a little more complicated than SaaS, but it can be done. And there are many ways. There are probably as many business models as there are open source projects, by the way. So that's for the business side. But from a European standpoint, probably, and this is my theory, and I'm actually writing a book, but my theory is that Europe should stimulate radical openness to catch up and break monopolies. Openness can break monopolies. So it's interesting from the standpoint of a nation that wants to catch up. Europe is a supra-nation, even though it's not a formal federation, right? So the US has a lead, but we could say it's mostly the state of California and the state of Washington that have taken the lead, with corporations living there. But the US is leading the pack when it comes to digital affairs. China, with a very top-down approach, is also catching up rapidly. Europe is nowhere. So if we are humble, even though we have acute, I'm sorry for your members, but I'm one of them. We have a farm of cute little startups, the supply side, okay? We are not making a dent, I'm sorry. we have not made a dent yet. So sure, it's part of the ecosystem, but most of it is not making a dent in terms of revenue and value capture, because all of it tends to be consolidated in the stack. So how do we compete? And I'm thinking about the European Commission, which doesn't quite get it. Open source is esoteric, and then of course lobbying is telling us it's bad, it's full of holes. It does not mean business, right? So there's a lot of counter lobbying against Europe promoting openness. But it is, to me, unless we're able to federate the Draghi budget, that is 800 billion, and funnel it exactly where it matters, two things that are highly unlikely because we just don't have the money and we don't have the discipline. Hence, open source probably being the most efficient, the most radical, and the most affordable option for Europe and nations to adopt to catch up collectively. Right? Now, the open source approach for business models, that's a very specific conversation, case by case.
No, this is really, really interesting. And I guess the vision here is that we end up with sort of a competitive nirvana where for each and every type of product or service that you want, there would be a lot of offers out there in a really competitive and full marketplace. And so I guess it just comes down to the demand side, like that we get. This is you've been a great part of the Eurostack movement, which is really calling on governments to stimulate the demand by looking to buy more European, if you will, if you could boil it down to one sentence. Um, is so I hear you, and I think it's a really fascinating idea to say let's really sort of go all in on the open element. It does mean that somebody's got to start being a customer so that we can stimulate some demand there. Because I'm a believer that once demand comes, that the market, that all of these players will appear or become more visible in the marketplace. Right now, it feels like it's probably a lot of work to assemble these kind of things into sort of a package. This is the convenience factor that the hyperscalers have is, you do one contract and you've got a suite of 300 things in there. How long do you think it's going to take, or what's it going to take until we get to a point where, let's say, some open based packages, bundles, systems, ways of operating happen so that the convenience factor is met?
So it's not a dogmatic nor binary affair. When I talk about openness, it's clearly recognizing the virtue of this approach from a public standpoint, public administration or public policy standpoint. If we consider that Silicon Valley has like 30 or 40 years, headway, then it might take us 30 or 40 years to create the market, the conditions, the consolidation, so that we end up with $1 trillion company, right? So the supply side. The demand side, meanwhile, is stuck choosing IBM, i.e., the decision maker is never going to be fired from choosing IBM all over again, which means Microsoft and Google and Apple, right? So these are the safe choices. The technology underlying, by the way, is open source, right? None of these giants exist without the open source. Built by whom? By everybody else, right? These companies are just better at marketing, at packaging. Now, openness is a way to me to accelerate. In fact, if you do not create a sort of acceleration agent within it, within the policy making, if we're serious as Europeans to create an industry out of technology, and I think we've reached a point where we understand it's a strategic industry. It's not just any industry, right? It's not luxury or tourism, right? These are somewhat less strategic for a nation. Technology has become strategic. Technology has never been as political as it is today. So I think we get it now, collectively. And our regulators also are getting the message.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, I'd love to hear
So
your
sorry, I
statement.
want to interrupt you here because
Yeah.
I just want to make sure that my position is not misinterpreted. Openness is not a binary affair.
Mhm.
It's a two-pronged approach where you need to connect the demand with whatever is being created. So we have the supply side. So the supply side is not getting a lot of business, by the way.
Mhm.
So we could say, okay, let's connect supply and demand, but that could take 30 years. We need to connect supply and demand. But if you provide horizontal openness stimulation, then you probably accelerate by a factor of 3. You can do it in a decade. Why? Because you will create externalities, positive externalities, that will accelerate the creation of entrepreneurial energies. Because that's it. I mean, that's a fact. Every company needs to create a shortcut to build value-adding solution. So they use open source very often. And the more open source there is, the more empowerment there is to accelerate cycles. Right? So this is exactly the theory here. Openness is an accelerant to connecting supply and demand. But then, of course, governments have to say there needs to be a certain amount of European patriotism when it comes to buying tech. Certain amount. Right now, there is none. There is no requirement, and most of it goes to US companies. So that's, if we don't do anything, every year we sink. We need to break that tragedy.
Mhm. Yeah, I would love to go a little deeper on this thought because anybody who pays attention to what's happening in Europe, politically and geopolitically, and even the talk in Brussels, can see that the phrase European tech sovereignty is now kind of everywhere. But it is a bit of a Rorschach test to see how people are defining it because the critics would say, "Oh, this is just anti-American. Never use U.S. big tech," and so we have a lot of different opinions along the spectrum of how sovereign can anybody get? Because some people say they throw up their hands and say, look, you can, interdependencies in technology all the way down to the chips level, are baked in. And so you're never going to be 100% independent or sovereign from each other, whether it's China, the US, Europe, or other areas. How do you define tech sovereignty? And why is it important for Europe in your view?
To me, it's quite simple. I define sovereignty by lack of sovereignty, and then creating a chain of trajectory. Because every year right now, we are, as Europeans, losing sovereignty. So we go from almost no sovereignty to worse than none. That is not acceptable. So we need to change the trend. Sovereignty, if you look at if you're looking for binary definitions, no country today has total tech sovereignty. None, not even the US. For the US, when it comes to software, but also when it comes to hardware, actually, chips is mostly sovereign. That is true. But the machines are still assembled in China and the chips are being fabricated in Taiwan, right? So that's why Taiwan is so strategic for the US. So to me, the only thing that matters is reversing the trend because the debate around absolute tech sovereignty is moot. The question is not, and I don't think that's what Europe wants to be. I don't think that is what defines Europe. The goal is not to exclude US or Chinese technology. The question is to be the sparring partner. So we need to muscle up and provide technology that actually can help solve a number of problems to reach a collective market share that looks like something. Right now, it looks like nothing. So I'm thinking of it as a nondescript amount of market share when it comes to tech. So we need to choose our battle. Typically, chips, super expensive, decades in the making. You know what? Once you buy them, you own them. So it is the least worse type of dependency than software as a service, right? So depending on Microsoft, this 365 with a software as a service license is the worst possible type of dependency. Having a dependency on NVIDIA, AMD, and Intel is not that bad because once you buy the chips, you own them. So I would choose our battle, but I'm mostly concerned nowadays about AI because AI is another troubling factor. It is an exponential type of technology on top of exponential technologies of the past deeply anchored in microtransistors. But if you combine Moore's law plus big data plus AI, you have a triple exponential, which is troublesome. So we need to find a way to cut this dynamicity and make sure that this AI does not create the conditions of the worst possible types of dependency, which is knowledge as a service. Knowledge as a service, therefore, humanity's knowledge, humanity's content captured by a few handful of companies, typically the same, that would rent it back to us. And we would be forever in servitude. That comes with biases in the data and so on and so forth. So that is simply unacceptable. So we need to find a way, probably at the very top of the stack, but also somewhere in the middle of the stack, to create alternatives and start building on top of them. It doesn't mean, again, kicking out AWS, GCP, and Azure, but why don't we make sure that at least all of the backups are on regional cloud providers, right? So that we create a condition for multi-cloud, multi-sourcing. We create a wedge. We create a sort of, hey, we're the clients. We understand that the future is unknown. You need to build a condition for resilience. Public procurement, but also private procurement, actually needs to take this as a risk management issue. They need to think about the consequences of depending on technology that is 100% dependent on Mr. Trump's decision. That is an issue, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not because it's the US. It's because that is a single point of failure, right?
Mm-hmm.
Geopolitics have become a single point of failure for tech. That's it.
Yeah.
So CEOs and CFOs have to take that into account and build accordingly and buy accordingly.
No, absolutely. One final thought on the sovereignty issue, because you have a close experience of it. Several years ago, there was a move in Europe, especially France and Germany, teamed up on a project called Gaia-X to try to get a federated cloud going. This was sort of government led, but then it brought in industry to try and come up with an architecture for how can we create some kind of a more open system. And it failed, or it so far hasn't succeeded. Let's be friendly, nice about it. You, in fact, took Scaleway out of Gaia-X as a project, so I know you were deeply involved. What in your mind was the reason why the Gaia-X wasn't working, and especially what can we learn from that? Because we don't want to repeat those mistakes again.
So Gaia-X was a very good idea when you consider its narrow initial ambition. The German project, Gaia-X, aimed to create the blueprints for data spaces on top of US hyperscalers. So the first initial version of Gaia-X was a German idea that heavily relied on hyperscalers and wanted to protect industrial data from hyperscalers. That made sense. But at some point, the project grew and France was added to it. And then on top of data spaces, the goal was to create a sort of federated cloud, a sort of European Airbus. That was the fantasy. Little did they know that the playbook was written by Microsoft.
Mm-hmm.
Microsoft was going to have none of that, right? So basically, the project was doomed. As soon as the ambition was to create a sort of federated cloud that would hinder some of the key proponents of the initial project. So lobbying, divergent interests created the condition for failure, created conditions for nasty behind the scenes board maneuvering. Such a waste of time, such a waste of money. So I basically slammed the door at some point. I was on the board. I was one of the co-founders, 11 French co-founders. So I was one of the co-founders, but it wasn't my choice. I joined Scaleway and they said, oh, here's the hot potato, deal with it. I did. But the project proved to be a dead end very quickly. And I could see it coming. So I slammed the door. And some people have basically dared to follow my move. Others didn't dare to follow. End result, huge waste of time. So
That's a shame. But
Forces at play. Yeah.
we have, speaking of time, we have, I think, about just a few minutes left. So thanks also for giving us your time on a busy morning. I would love to turn a little bit to something that hasn't been a waste of time, which is France Digital, because it's been around now for around 13 years, and you were involved in its forming. So I'm curious to talk about the French ecosystem, because for those who aren't familiar, perhaps in European tech, everyone looks very admiringly towards the French ecosystem, towards Paris, towards what President Macron has done in really prioritizing French technology. But it's also a community-led effort. It's not just one person. Tell me, what is it for you that makes the French tech scene so successful now? Why is it succeeding? Because 10, 15 years ago, this was not, the hotbed of technology in Europe.
There's a bit of luck, and there's a lot of willingness to succeed, and usually with a number of leaders in the pack. So I was one of the co-founders of France Digital, but I was not at the helm. I was not driving this. I thought it was a good idea to join, but the few people who created France Digital assembled 20 startups, 20 entrepreneurs, and 20 VCs. And this was created as a result of a bug coming from the Hollande government, right? The socialist government was elected, and they immediately wanted to tax football players and bankers, aligning capital gain tax on income, which was already heavily taxed in France. By doing so, they would have completely collapsed the incentive to create a startup in France. So we were talking about 65% tax
Wow.
on your income if you were to sell your company after 10 years, right? So you don't pay yourself, you spend grueling hours building a company, you exit after 10 years, you sell for 1 million or you sell for 10 million, and you would have ended up paying 63, 65% taxes. This would have been a kiss of death to the ecosystem. And so France Digital was created to counter that. So there was a movement called the Pigeons movement. And that movement led to the creation of France Digital, which became a lobby to explain to the government that it was a bad idea to align that tax without considering the effect on a very dynamic ecosystem that is the future of employment, the future of innovation, and so on and so forth. And within the Hollande government, you had a number of key people, including Fleur Pellerin, including Emmanuel Macron. So all these people were junior ministers at the time, and so forth. They listened to France Digital, and Fleur Pellerin created a condition for a digressive tax regime. So if you sold your company for 10 million within a year, you would be heavily taxed. But if you sold it for after 10 years, you were not taxed at all, below 30%, 28%, to the point where Xavier Niel said, so one of the French billionaires and very much involved in tax, said, France is a fiscal paradise, to which I said, it's a bit exaggerated, but okay, anyways. So, the taxation was gradually voted. No, the gradient was voted in 2013 for the PLF 2013. And France Digital became a formal lobby to interface, represent the interests of VCs, of course, but also startups and entrepreneurs, and has been a structuring force. Along the way, and actually around that time as well, the logo and the term French tech was coined by the very same people. And so the government pushed French tech, which in a way acted as a catalyst to stop French bashing. Because the French, they love bashing French tech. And with French tech, we got a bit of pride. Because the French aren't that bad after all. So the combination of France Digital and French tech in some ways has created a very good momentum. We could have actually collapsed in 2013 had we not had France Digital and its work to actually be the proper interface with the government to actually correct some dogmatic taxation. And the rest is history, right? We've been building It turns out that France is pretty good in applied math, so we're relevant in AI, where the French are quite creative. But, London is still ahead of the pack. Berlin is not dissimilar to Paris. So every hub has its own history. But France has had a good has had a good ride. So hopefully we can keep it up.
That's fantastic. I love the fact that I did not know this element, that actually first being under threat is what had everyone pull together.
Yes,
And the momentum that came from that is still powering the system. Let that be a lesson to all of us who are fighting now for European tech. The threat
absolutely.
from the threat in Ukraine and coming from the White House, maybe it's pulling us together also to get some momentum. We have just a couple seconds left. I'd love to go through the lightning round, some just quick questions with really short answers, and then I know you have to go. But I've been really enjoying our conversation. Let's talk about something you love about Europe, because you could have been in Silicon Valley, you could have been working anywhere. You've chosen to be here.
So what I love about Europe is the depth of our multiple cultures, languages. While it's a challenge, I like the ability to go from one country to the other. And in fact, I benefited from that when the UK was part of Europe. I drove to Cambridge, UK, with my dad's car, packed with all my things, and I moved to Cambridge, got a job, you know, in '94. It was brilliant,
Yeah,
and now I'm sad because I don't benefit from that. I recognize the complexity of the European project is still unfinished. So the Schengen area is a blessing. We should protect it. That means we should probably be serious about what it means to defend borders. What are the borders? The world is not a friendly place. So we need to define what borders are. If it's national, it's national. If it's European, it's not European. So we need to be serious about that. But Europe is wonderful in terms of its values, in terms of its social equilibrium. So I live in the US as well. The US is brutal socially in terms of safety net, brutal. Europeans don't necessarily know that. And so I think we have something which is a delicate balance that we need to protect. We need to keep on working on the European project, and it's worth fighting for.
super. What's You're somebody who has been involved in teaching entrepreneurs and mentoring so much. Let's turn it around. What's the best piece of advice you've ever received? Something that you find yourself still applying or living by?
The notion of budget, the budget itself means absolutely nothing. In fact, it's probably your worst enemy. What really, really matters is an amount of budget applied to time. How much time does it buy you? Is this spend actually more efficient, right? So as an individual decision maker, but also as a entrepreneur, right, in charge of a budget that you raise, how is it that you take that money, put it to good use? In the US, in fact, there's this really well understood notion of money burning your pocket. If you have money, you have to put it to good use, right? In Europe, it's not so clear. So I'm applying that advice as much as I can. How can you
Brilliant.
best use the proceeds towards time, not
That,
towards the spend?
that's brilliant. Last couple of questions. One, what's a piece of tech you miss from the 80s, 90s, 2000s? Do you have a piece of tech, something you wish was still around?
It's very nostalgic, mostly around sounds. I miss 8-bit sounds, right? In fact, the reverse of it, we talk about anthropomorphic, right? Anthropomorphism. In fact, the interfaces sometimes try to blend with human or humanness. And I think that's kind of deceiving. What I liked about the 80s is that the machines were really just that, machines. So you knew where you stood. Nowadays, there's a lot of deception built in, even in assistants, even LLMs, right? You feel that you're talking to someone. Meanwhile, it's very deceiving because you're not talking to someone, right? So I liked that dimension, but it's captured in my mind. My Prussian Madeleine is mostly acoustic sound, 8-bit sounds.
Brilliant. That's great. Final note, final question. What's something that makes you optimistic about the future of Europe?
There's momentum. There's momentum in everything. We do have to fight to preserve the values that we've constructed. I feel that Mr. Trump is helping us in a counterintuitive way by dismissing Europe as a key partner. I think that's a mistake. But as dismissing Europe as a key partner by saying America first, I think that is what we need, a little kick in the ass uh, to redefine what it is to be Europe and European 80 years after World War II. So I believe our destinies are linked with the US, but the US has created the conditions post World War II for Europe to thrive on a idealistic project that lasted 80 years. I think that era is over. And so we need to reassess and build not so much independently, but again, as a force for good, in line with our values. So that means reflecting on the value and not necessarily being a copycat of Silicon Valley or the US, because that's a moot objective. What matters is the end, not the means. So how do we create something that is different from the US, different from China, different from India? So I'm hopeful because I think that we are seeing that now is the time to actually define what it is.
Super. Well, you're one of the people helping define it. So thanks so much, Yann Lechelle, for being with us today. And
Excellent.
best of luck. And people can, of course, find you online at probabl.ai, probabl.ai. And wish you all the best of luck. And I really hope that with your leadership, Europe and the Eurostack project and all of these other efforts are going to succeed. So thanks a lot.
Thanks.